educate, empower, enable, impact. Thank you for tuning in to That Will Never Work podcast, where we share inspiring information and personal experiences related to business and the entrepreneurial journey from those who are leaders in their respective field. Now, here's your host, author and business coach, Maurice.
Thank you very much for tuning in today. I appreciate you listening. I have a wonderful guest today. She is the founder of Make It Memorable, a presentation consultant, a graphic designer, and teacher. She uses her background in psychology and graphic design to help clients take their complex ideas and turn them into powerful presentations, lessons, and visual stories. She specializes in designing memorable and influential slides that help the audience gain a deeper understanding of the topic. She has worked with a wide range of clients, such as North Carolina State University, RTI International, Pfizer, and WebMD. And when she isn't working with clients on their presentation, she's teaching graphic design at Wake Technical Community College. I thank y'all for listening today. I bring the other to the microphone, Danielle. Danielle, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Maurice.
Sure, no problem. So, you have a wide range background, psychology, talking about graphic design. First, let's begin with graphic design, that idea. What is graphic design?
Oh, that's such a good question. It is almost anything and everything that is visually designed, I would say.
Okay.
So I work primarily with print design. So that's like brochures, postcards, logos. But there's also social media ads, social media posts, there's websites, there's web banners, there's emails. There's graphic designers that work in UX, so they're the ones that kind of design how websites flow. But basically, it's just visual communication is all it is. So boiling everything down to you're communicating whatever that message is, and how do you show that to the audience in a visual way that resonates with them?
Here's the reason why I asked. And I understand it's such a generic and basic question. Sometimes we don't really know what is graphic design and what we're looking for and the value that graphic designers have. Sometimes we think just because we can, their everyday person, hey, you know what? I can use Canva. Now I'm a graphic designer. Sometimes we don't understand, typography. We don't understand color, harmony, things like that. So that's why I asked, what is a graphic designer? I know we can go down a whole rabbit hole with that, right? But one of the things that you had mentioned was storytelling, right? In your presentations and things like that. First, let's talk about why is that important about storytelling in my presentations?
Yeah, so I think when people present, typically, they focus on what they need to say, right? So that's oftentimes why we get these really bad slides, death by PowerPoint, if you will, where it's just like a whole bunch of text that I've crammed on that slide so that I remember what I need to say.
Right.
And it's all about the speaker or the presenter and focusing on their needs.
Right.
But ultimately, audiences don't learn that way. There's a ton of research out there that talks about how people learn, and it's not from looking at a slide full of text as you read it to them. It's actually a great way to experience cognitive overload where you just can't process anything else. And so what happens is that if you can use storytelling in your presentations, no matter if it's the most dry concept at all, you can get the audience to come along with you, and they're more likely to remember it. So there's a lot of other techniques. You don't have to use just storytelling, but storytelling, I think, is one of the easiest ways because you're typically talking about something that you've done. And what you've done, there's been a problem and a solution. There's been a conflict and a resolution. There's been something that you were struggling with, and then you came to some sort of end point. That is a story, right? It's just we don't think of it as stories because the way we tell it is I did this and I did this and I did this and I did this. But if you shift that into I did this, but this wasn't working.
Right.
Now the audience cares, right? Okay, well, what wasn't working? How did you fix it, right? And it's just that simple shift in language that can really make your presentation more engaging and the audience can make it more memorable, right?
So I started off by talking about, colors, fonts, typography, fonts, things like that. how important is knowing that in trying to tell my story in my presentation? How does that affect what I'm trying to present or convey?
A lot, but I would say if you are an individual and you don't have a budget to bring someone in, you can still do it without experts, right? So it's more a matter of, so with fonts and colors and where things are positioned, it determines where the audience is looking, and it determines how they feel about something, right?
Right.
So for example, typography, there has been some newer research that's been done in terms of how people feel about specific typefaces. So if you are looking at a sans serif typeface, the ones that are like blocky versus serif typeface, the ones that have little like lines at the ends of them, you feel different ways about them, right? And we know in terms of legibility, in terms of how easy it is to read something, that people find typefaces that they've already seen as more legible and readable, and also that the more difficult it is, the more difficult we think the task is, right? And so if you have a really difficult to read typeface, you're now telling your audience that whatever your message is now hard. And that oftentimes what I see when people start, they choose a typeface that's interesting or a font that's interesting, right? They're like, oh, this looks cool. I'm going to use this in whatever I'm making.
Right.
But that's not the purpose of the typeface. The purpose is to communicate, right? And so if you're communicating something in a typeface that doesn't align with your message, then it's going to be harder for the audience to process it, and you might actually be inadvertently making your message harder to read or understand.
So let me ask this then. So how would I get over the angst, of doing a presentation and understanding all these little pieces, because like you said, I just want to make it look pretty. It looks interesting to me. I hope someone else would be interested in it, but listening to you, it may not be that simple sometimes, because we don't always understand our audience. And we understand everyone learns differently. They take in information differently. So how do we not get too anxious about this type of presentation?
Yeah, so anxiety manifests in a lot of ways, right? And I think everyone kind of a lot of people experience their own level of anxiety, right? And so I think that it's about finding where your triggers are and addressing those, right? Some people get really anxious going on stage. And if that's the case, then there's lots of techniques that you can use to make that easier. If it's, you're throwing up and you're like losing sleep over it, I would highly recommend getting a therapist, because that can be fixed. It can be easier. If you're just like, I get really nervous and I start sweating and I feel like I start stammering and my heart starts racing, then there's a lot of techniques that you can use in terms of you go for a walk beforehand, you do some type of exercise to burn off the adrenaline, you can squeeze your toes and release them, you can practice box breathing. Like there's a ton of things that you can do, right? So that's oftentimes what I see people experience with that. But if you're experiencing angst over kind of like, how do I communicate my message? One, I would say figure out who your audience is, right? So your audience is going to determine how you communicate that message. If you're talking to a bunch of people who know the exact niche that you know, then you can communicate differently than if you're talking to the general public. But I would argue that you don't want to have too much jargon regardless of your organization and how you're speaking to them, because we know that the easier something is to understand, the easier it is to remember. So if you can kind of remove that vocabulary that the audience has to keep in their working memory, which is basically what controls how much cognitive overload we have, we only have about 4 spaces in it. So if I'm keeping one of those spaces open or used for your vocabulary term, then I only have 3 spaces left to remember your content. So it's about making it like easy as possible for the audience to process the information. And then if it's angst about like, how do I show what I'm talking about, I would argue that you want to just go as simple as possible to start. So what I find is that people oftentimes, like I said, want to make it interesting, right? They want to make it jazzy. They want to make it pop. And oftentimes by doing that, you're actually giving the audience more visual stimulation to look at various areas of the slide, and you're not bringing them to what matters. So I would argue like going simpler is better. And then as you get better at knowing design skills, like I would recommend getting, Rob, I'm forgetting her last name, but there's a book called Designing for Nondesigners. You can get it, there's a whole bunch of editions, and she goes over the basic 4 principles that she recommends.
Okay.
I teach 6 principles that I typically teach in my presentations, where you're thinking about where the audience is looking, how can you direct their attention, and how can you focus on like alignment and how close things are together. So there's a lot of, you can learn these things, right? It's not this amorphous idea that you have no control over. You can absolutely learn how to control where the audience is looking. But at the beginning, what I see is that people put like, I'm going to put some jazzy little GIFs over here, and I'm going to put something really bright and shiny over here, and then my text is going to be big and bold, and then this like really difficult to read typeface because that looks interesting. And it's really hard for the audience to know where to look and where to process.
So one of the things that you're mentioning, which is to keep it simple. A lot of times, you'll hear people talk about, hey, make it interesting to keep people's attention and things like that. And sometimes we miss the mark in that. Like you said, it's too confusing. It's too all over the place. It's too, it's overstimulating the audience, whatever it is. So how do we understand what the balance is in that? Because, a lot of times when we're doing these presentations, it may not necessarily be for us. It may be for our manager, our VP, whatever it is, and to the C-suite, if you will, because that's a whole nother level of anxiety, right? So how do we make it so that we understand the balance to that? So was something like this book, or do you have anything else that you can offer that where the average person will understand that?
Yeah, so I'd say your message should be interesting. It's not the slide deck, right? The slide deck is there to serve you as the presenter and help you communicate your message. And if the slide deck is the audience's focal point, then there's no reason for you to be there, right? But that's not how we learn. So there's a theory in psychology called the multimedia effect that basically says that we learn best when there are visuals that represent the auditory information that we're hearing. So when I'm telling you something and I'm showing you visuals that represent it.
Okay.
We don't learn best when there is a whole bunch of text on the slide that I'm reading and I'm reading it to you. And there have been some more recent studies that have looked at people just calling into presentations versus being in hybrid. And they found that calling in actually was more memorable to them than being in the hybrid mode, which I find fascinating because it kind of goes against the multimedia effect. But that has been like a more recent research, so we're kind of like playing with what that looks like. Okay. But ultimately, the idea there is that what you're saying matters, right? What you're communicating is what the audience is focusing on, and that's what should be the focus of your presentation. So instead of focusing on your slide deck, you would probably be better off going in and doing that presentation with no deck and just talking to them in a way that resonates with them. And so using storytelling, telling them why, especially if you're presenting to management or C-suites, tell them why it matters, right? Break it down to why they care, because it's not about like what you did. It's about what is the outcome? What is the call to action at the end? What is the solution to the problem that you're going about? And if you don't have a solution, then talking about like what the process was to figuring that out and what you're expecting the outcomes to be based off of what you've done the research in, right? So if like you're in Q4 and Q3 was really high and Q4 is going down, then okay, well, why? Like that's what they want to know, right? That's the solution that they want to focus on. And so talking about the different reasons as to why is what they're going to care about versus you going through the statistics and the data about like every single product that you're selling or whatever it is that your major Q4 go down, because that's ultimately the reason why they care is what is going to make your presentation memorable.
So what can I use, or what would be something simple to use if I'm just getting started in doing presentations? Something that I may already have. Is that useful enough, or do I need to go purchase something? How can I make this thing happen for us?
Yeah, so I recommend before you start making a presentation, taking out a blank sheet of paper or opening a Word doc and writing an outline. Because ultimately what the outline will do is it will help you structure your thoughts. And you can see, is this just a string of random ideas? Does this connect together? Do I have 4 or less chunks that I'm presenting? So am I presenting way too many different ideas, or do they fit together? Because the audience is going to remember 3 to 4 chunks, and with 3 to 4 ideas within each chunk. So if you have 2 chunks with 8 ideas in it, they're probably not going to remember all those.
Right.
And then thinking about the order. So we remember what comes first and last most. So making sure that that's where the most important content is. Oftentimes I hear people say, tell the audience what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. Well, now the tell them is in the middle, which is the least memorable section. And that doesn't mean that they're going to forget it, but you have to intentionally counteract that by how you're presenting the information. And so I would say, like, doing that outline helps you structure your ideas. It helps you put down how you're going to say it, how you're going to use analogies, metaphors, stories to help the audience come along with what you're doing. Where are you going to put in those examples? Where are you going to explain what the data means? How are you going to explain what the data means using your outline? Anyways, once you make the outline, then you basically have your slide notes. So then you copy and paste whatever you were going to have in the outline into the notes section in PowerPoint or Google Slides, it doesn't matter. And then you figure out, how do I turn that visual if possible? So if my point about, like, let's say we're doing Q4 is now lower than Q3. Okay, so you could have a chart or a graph to represent that. Don't put a table on. But if you're going to do that, you also want to be really selective. So you want to only include the data that matters. Don't include every single product that you sell, because that's going to be overstimulating. Possibly just do the total, right? Or if it's something that could be done in an infographic, great. If it's something that you could have an image of, okay, awesome. If it's something that you're telling a story about, then show an image that represents that story. You can still include text. I'm not anti-text, but the text should be one idea at a time. Right? So I'm going to show you one slide with one idea on it, and then I'm going to go to the next idea. Oftentimes I see people saying like, oh, well, I'm doing a 30-minute presentation, so I need 10 slides. Well, it doesn't matter if you have 10 slides or 300 slides. If you have 30 minutes of content, you have 30 minutes of content. But what ends up happening is, if you have 10 slides and you're showing each slide for roughly 3 minutes, especially in virtual, the audience is tuned out. They've checked their email.
Yeah, right.
So if you can break it into more chunks and show one idea at a time, the audience is much more likely to pay attention to you. They're much more likely to follow along. And we've shown that that's how people process information better, especially in the virtual environment, because movement is what pulls our attention back to that screen.
So you've mentioned virtual a few times, right, as we're speaking. And a lot of people are trying to really, pull back off of being virtual and going back into, bodies and seats, whether it's in the church setting, whether it's in the business setting, whatever it might be. So I think it's a little easier to present in a virtual setting sometimes, because I don't have to see everybody's face, but I'm just talking to a screen. So how would I get over that, angst, even just talking to people in person, especially if I'm used to being in this virtual space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first off, practice in very small and contained settings is really helpful. So that could be that you ask friends and family to just watch you practice with the minimal amount of people that you want in the room. So maybe start with like 3 or 4. And then try and make it a little bit larger and practice in front of those people, and practice in a situation where it's actually realistic to what you'll be presenting at. So if you're presenting in a boardroom, see if you can get a room that is similar, ideally the same room if you can, but at least a similar room. So can you get colleagues that you trust to come with you, that you know is a safe space? The audience is rooting for you. I have never been in a presentation where the audience was hoping the presenter would fail. So it's also just remembering that as the presenter, the audience wants you to succeed. They're there for a reason. They want to hear your value. Right. And so reminding yourself that they're not there to like poke holes in your argument. And if they are asking you questions, it's so that they better understand it, right? So I would say that, like, remembering that, practicing in a way that is, it feels safe, and then finding a way to keep your notes with you, because I think one of the things with virtual that we find really comforting is that we can have our notes directly in front of us
Right.
and we can basically read them. I
Right,
don't
right,
recommend
right.
it, but you can.
Right.
And then you're not going to forget anything. So one, if you forget something, no one is going to know except for you.
Mm-hmm.
Just let it go, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you get stuck at some point, then I recommend having water or a cup of tea or something near you, ideally something that is non-caffeinated, because that tends to make you more jittery if you get nervous.
Right.
And if you forget at any point, just take a sip.
Right, right.
That's like 5 seconds that you bought yourself. And it may feel like forever on stage, but the audience they don't care. They see that you're drinking and it's fine, right? I feel like people get nervous when they memorize things. So I highly recommend memorizing, what comes next, but not memorizing the exact way in which you're going to say it. So thinking about that outline that I talked about earlier, if you memorize like each of those chunks so that I know this is coming and then this is coming and then this is coming, if I forget what I'm going to say, I can just move on to that next chunk. And if I remember, then I can hopefully bring it back in another way. Don't tell the audience you forgot. They won't know the difference, right? And then ideally have a monitor in front of you so that you can have your speaker notes there. So in PowerPoint and Google Slides, you can have a presenter mode where you can see the notes in front of you, and then the other screen that the audience sees is just the presentation. And if you can angle it in a way that you can see it, then that gives you a little bit of comfort, and that way you can remember what you want to say there, ideally not reading it, right? And I would recommend not staying in front of your computer the whole time, but if you need it for a slide or two, or you need to come back to it, then that's okay.
So in what you're talking about, which is practice, a lot of times we skip that step.
Yes.
And we don't realize the real value in practicing. I don't care what it is, whether we are graphic designers and we want to do this presentation, or we want to speak or present, whatever it is, we don't understand the real value in practice. And you've mentioned it a few times also. So is that something that you hear in your industry, about doing these presentations? Is that a crucial step that people are expressing to people the value of, or is that something that you find that people are kind of skipping?
I think some people think they don't have time to practice, or maybe that they're above practicing, that they can just wing it, or that they just don't allow enough time in the schedule to make the presentation before, like in enough time to be able to practice it. So it depends on what you're presenting, right? If you just have like a one-off meeting with your supervisor, I would say it depends on how valuable that conversation is. I would still practice it 100%. I would probably practice it a minimum of 3 times. But if it's, a weekly check-in that it's not anything critical, then that may not need that level of practice, right? But if you're asking for a raise, or if something went wrong and you're telling them what happened, definitely practice it. So I think from what I have seen, the more practice, obviously, the better. But I highly recommend to the people that I coach, you want to do a presentation, if you can, minimum a week before the presentation date, absolute minimum. And that gives you enough time to finesse your slides, come up with how you're going to say things, how things work together. Because once you have it there and you start practicing, you might have thought this worked really well in your head, but when you start running through it, things don't really align in the same way that you thought they would. So that allows you to adjust things. And then minimum, I recommend practicing 3 times, because that allows you to get the reps in, but also you can start to see, like, does it flow? Because oftentimes, at least when I'm making a new presentation, the first couple times that I'm running through it, I'm just running through it to see, does the order of this make sense? Does it need to shift around? Does that example make sense? Do I need a better example? Can I bring that example back in this one? And like, I'm playing with how I'm telling it, and it's less about me feeling comfortable with the content. But that's also presentations I'm going to give, and I'll use them again, or they're for an organization that's paying me, so I want to make sure that they're great, right? So if you're just doing, an quarterly check-in, then that might be something that you don't need that same level of run-throughs, but I would highly recommend still doing 3 minimum.
Okay. So, Danielle, you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of information. And so let me ask you this. Where can people find this presentation coaching, or any workshops or any creative services that you may offer if I am in this position to do presentations or I need to speak to my C-suite, whatever it might be? Where can they find you and get this coaching from?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a website that's makeitmemorable.studio, and I periodically run live workshops or pre-recorded workshops. I'm running one in March, and that is 5 weeks of basically presentation training. So take a look for the next one. I typically run it on Eventbrite, but I also post regularly on LinkedIn. Danielle Hennis. If you search for me, I believe I'm the only one still. And I have a newsletter that I send out every 3 weeks or so on Fridays that kind of gives presentation tips on how you can apply them to your life. I try to really make them actionable. So I only send them out if I think that they're valuable. I'm not going to spam you with other content. So that is how you can stay in touch or reach me. And I would love to help you with your next presentation.
Danielle, I appreciate you coming on today. And of course, all this information that she had given will be in the show notes. So you'll be able to follow her. Just click on the link and you're right there. Thank you very much, Danielle.
Thank you, Maurice.
You're welcome. But before I let you go, I got to ask you my question, my would you rather question.
Okay.
Would you rather choose 3 doors or a fork in the road?
Oh, I'm really bad at the decisions.
Really?
Yeah, really bad. When I travel by myself, I love it because I can do anything, but I probably spend an hour looking at all the choices before I make a decision. So I'm going to choose the fork in the road because there's only 2, so that makes it easier.
Okay. See, I thought you was going to have something deep, analytical, something like that. You're like, no. You're doing one or the other. Well, that's cool, Danielle. I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great.
Sure. And thank you for listening to That Will Never Work podcast.
Thanks for listening. Find us on social media at Chisholm Group LLC and check back weekly for new episodes. Until next time, that will never work, or will it?